Dear Sandfall Interactive, your game, Expedition 33, has haunted my thoughts for the past several months. I finished it hours before the Game Awards aired, where it won almost every award it was nominated for. Then a week later, I booted up the game again, from the beginning, which I never do for RPGs, this time with a pen and paper in hand to write down my conflicted feelings. And even that didn't feel like enough. I wanted to put my thoughts down on a website like Backlogged, but writing a short review for this game doesn't feel like enough. I've recorded maybe an hour's worth of voice messages to my friends, talked to them in person about it, but nothing feels like it's enough. My thoughts on Expedition 33 are exceptionally complicated, and I want to express them in a way that feels meaningful and respectful toward the people who made this work of art a reality. So I wrote a script, letter, video essay thing, and here it is. Expedition 33 is a story about grief and escapism, but these themes have been discussed ad nauseum in other video essays and editorials. I want to talk about the auxiliary elements, the main characters that serve as vehicles for these ideas, and the writing choices that, in my opinion, do these characters a disservice. I'm going to take a particularly analytical look at this game's narrative down to a minute level, taking into account the various character interactions, how those characters are or are not affected in a way that makes sense to their personality and worldview, and what all of this means for the narrative on a larger scale. To achieve this, I'd like to observe Sandfall's methodology, their do's and don'ts, and whether their intentions hold up when doing a close read of the text. Expedition 33 is also a reflection of the team that made it. Introspective and impassioned, with plenty to say and plenty of room for improvement. I think the game deserves its many awards, though I wouldn't go so far as to call it flawless. After all, for a team full of such new and gifted artists, it would be premature to say that Sandfall completely nailed it on their first try, to say that they don't have anything better in them.
You gotta suck first before you can get better, yeah? That's part of the process, that's growth. But you can only get there if you don't stop.
That's Jennifer Sviedberg-Yen, the lead writer for Expedition 33. In preparation for this video, I watched basically every interview I could find on her, and I grew to really respect her intelligence, honesty, humility, and passion. It is incredible that she managed to move so many people in her very first published work as a writer. And notably, a lot of her insights actually demonstrate areas where Expedition 33 could have been a more complete storytelling experience. I'm really excited about the prospect of a game from this team with an even better story than Clair Obscur, and so I want to hone in on those areas where I can. So, whether you're a fan of Expedition 33 or, by some miracle, a developer at Sandfall, take this open letter as words of encouragement for a story that was in equal parts compelling, evocative, and frustrating. For a team that can make beautiful works of art and with so much life ahead of it. For the game that comes after. Gustave is a perfectly written character. He's the highlight of Expedition 33's narrative, an emotionally mature, hopeful, and pragmatic figure that establishes the core ideology of the expedition. He paves the road for Maelle's growth and serves as the narrative foil for Verso. He's also the best example of ludonarrative cohesion in the game. The Lumina Converter, his invention, is what allows the party to succeed where previous expeditions could not. The Lumina mechanic only truly begins breaking the game in Act 2 and beyond, at which point Gustave, the person, is no more. But even in death, Gustave keeps the rest of the expedition alive.
For those who come after. Right?
For those who come after is, without a doubt, the most famous phrase from Expedition 33, but it's just one of the many mantras representative of Gustave and his allies.
When one falls, we continue. When one falls, we continue.
Yes, I know.
When one falls. When one falls. Not if, when.
Tomorrow comes.
Tomorrow comes.
These phrases serve as pillars for the expedition's motivation to keep moving forward year after year. They also serve as beacons for the narrative's core messaging of moving on from grief. But Sandfall seemingly wanted these expedition phrases, or at least Gustave's impression of them, to appear naive.
For him, his own personal arc, you can really see how he progressed from his initial very idealistic and somewhat naive approach to For Those Who Come After and When One Falls We Continue.
The death of Gustave ostensibly serves as the death of these mantras, and I think this was a poor direction to take his role in the narrative. It's true that Gustave begins his journey overly optimistic, and that he must learn through the death of his friends what For Those Who Come After really means. He eventually comes to a deeper, more profound understanding of these ideas, and makes a sacrifice to teach Maelle the same lesson. That is Gustave's character arc in a nutshell. Except, Maelle doesn't really ever consider his dying words. I had thought that Gustave's death would be an exceptional writing choice, because it was the most effective way to challenge the main cast as much as possible. But it doesn't impact the way they think, or their decision making in any meaningful capacity. Maelle doesn't inherit any of Gustave's character, his optimism and pragmatism, even during the Forgotten Battlefield segment where she lays him to rest.
I'll finish what you started. The paintress, Lenoir, they will pay.
If we are to suppose that these writing decisions demonstrate Maelle's inability to learn from Gustave's death, several other lines of dialogue make very little sense.
Gustave lives on in other ways, right? Through your memories, through his influence on your life and everyone else's.
Based on the rest of this story, this can't be true. I would argue that Gustave's death does influence Maelle's decision making, but the impact he had on her while he was alive does not. And this is an important distinction. It demonstrates that Gustave's personality, his character, matters far less in Expedition 33's narrative than the simple fact that Maelle loved him and that he died suddenly and tragically.
And that was a major emotional event for her that changed her from thinking of the mission as just, an excuse for her to go out and see the world to, okay, this is personal now.
To the narrative of Expedition 33, Gustave only matters insofar as a victim, so that Maelle can grieve and learn to live with their grief. It strips away the complexity of Gustave's ideology and the impact it should have on Maelle. Gustave's impact on Maelle in Act 2 and beyond is also extremely tell don't show.
Gustave would probably say, if more of us cared, then it would lighten the load for everyone.
Maelle will tell the party that she misses Gustave. When Maelle sees something exceptional, she wishes Gustave could have been there to see it. She says out loud that she wants to kill Renoir to avenge Gustave. But behaviorally, Gustave didn't affect how Maelle views the world, her role in it, or what she needs to accomplish. Compare this with how Gustave behaves following the death of Sophie, his love interest. Following the gamage, Gustave hardly ever utters Sophie's name.
Yeah, right. Enjoy myself.
But you can clearly see how she affects his decision-making. Gustave prioritizes Maelle's safety over all else, a parental imperative he has only because of Sophie's influence on him. And in an incredible show-don't-tell moment in the Flying Waters, Gustave has a vision of Sophie. She's still with him, as a part of him. This isn't a groundbreaking concept in the realm of visual media. It's a very common way to demonstrate how the death of a loved one impacts a character. So it's extremely strange that Maelle never has this moment with Gustave. We never have a solitary moment with Maelle where she contends with her thoughts and feelings. She only expresses this core element of Expedition 33's narrative through dialogue with other characters, and I think that's a shame. In the final act of Expedition 33, we get an Avengers Endgame moment, where the corpses of the past expeditioners are resurrected as mindless husks to fight for Maelle and Verso. The game calls it the greatest expedition in history, but nothing about what the expedition represents is present here. In fact, I can't think of anything more antithetical to the idea of For Those Who Come After than bringing back the people of the past without inheriting their will, their determination, or their humanity. But in a way, it's what Expedition 33 had been doing to Gustave since the beginning of Act 2. Verso, he who guards truth with lies. The introduction of Verso in Act 2 is probably where a lot of people were sold on Expedition 33's premise forever. I certainly thought I was at the time. The narrative excels so effortlessly in making Gustave likable to the point where his death emotionally challenges the player almost as much as it challenges the actual characters. And to add insult to injury, here comes Verso, the anti-Gustave, hijacking the narrative and dragging the player along for the ride. Where Gustave quite literally wore his heart on his sleeve, Verso is closed off and duplicitous. To the pre-existing cast and the player alike, he is alien, he is out of place, and he's just off. It's an exceptional foundation to leverage, to take these characters in far more interesting directions. But these characters should mean all the characters, right? There's a good chance you know where this is going. Lune and Ciel are effectively abandoned by the narrative as Act 2 progresses, and I think it's Verso's execution that is to blame. The most frustrating part is that Lune and Ciel should have a really interesting role to play in the party. While Maelle slowly starts to develop a similar bond with Verso to what she had with Gustave, Lune and Ciel remain suspicious of Verso's ulterior motives.
I was surprised you agreed so readily to Verso's plans. Do you trust him?
I trust that he wants to reach the Paintress, so for now, our interests are aligned.
He has been helpful. Still, I have this feeling he's hiding something.
But characters usually end up acting on those feelings, especially if the events of the plot compel them to do so. In the book Techniques of the Selling Writer, author Dwight Swain describes what he calls the motivation-reaction unit. According to Swain, there are two core elements of efficient character writing. The motivation, which is an event or action happening to a character, and then the reaction from that character, the emotional response, the voluntary and involuntary physical movements, and the conscious decision or vocal response that follows. To put it simply, stories are about action and reaction. Jennifer Svierberg-Yen corroborates this in her own presentation on writing, held at DICE Summit 2026.
A story is not. This happens, and then this happens, and then this happens. That's boring. That's not a real story. It's, in fact, this happens, therefore this happens. But then this happens, and therefore that happens, right? It's cause and effect. And you can apply that further to characters, right? We put them in a particular situation, right? It's not just these two characters interacting as who they are. You want to know, how does this change them?
The important thing about writing stories this way is that it gives characters agency. So, following the events in Old Lumiere, it turns out that Verso has been concealing the truth, that Renoir, the man who killed Gustave and the rest of Expedition 33, is Verso's father. In a moment where Lune and Ciel are proven right about their suspicions, we get this frankly strange scene.
Lying by omission is still lying.
I've told you everything you need to know.
I'd rather make that determination for myself.
I think we can all understand where each other's coming from, right? He hasn't steered us wrong yet. But we're a team now. And we won't get very far if we don't trust each other.
This argument is the furthest the narrative comes to giving Verso any consequences for his actions, and it still accomplishes nothing. In these situations where there's a schism between the various party members, Expedition 33 tends to gravitate toward having its main characters, Maelle and Verso, overrule the rest of the cast. Verso's propensity to lie is a consistent element of the game's narrative, and yet here he faces no accountability, and such little pushback from the party to the point where Lune and Ciel are ostensibly given zero agency in the narrative. They've been provided substantive proof that Verso is a pathological liar. And yet, seconds after confronting him, the party dynamic returns to the status quo. And it's easy to see why from a writer's perspective. It is narratively convenient, after all. How else is the expedition supposed to go from near breakup to taking down the Axons as a team? But taking the easy and convenient way out of a tension point in the narrative means losing out on some potentially great character moments.
Another pet peeve are characters who do certain things, right? Or say certain things because the plot needs them to do it. Not because it makes sense to them, not because it's what they want to do, not because it's within their motivation or their characterization.
I think this insight from Jennifer is really important because Expedition 33 largely succeeds in achieving this. It's clear that this was a prioritization when Sandfall wrote the story for this game, through actions like Gustave's sacrifice or the split endings in the final act. But in this particular scene, I think it's fair to say that Lune and Ciel did not do what would have made sense for their characters. I don't want to pull a "this is how it should have been written," but you can imagine the ways in which this kind of argument could have put longer term tension on the party, and how this could lead to really interesting storytelling and character growth. Because what we do have in the game, with the Axon section, Lune and Ciel might as well not exist for this part of the story. These shots where they get the finishing blow feel like hollow consolation prizes for a story that refused to give them anything else to do. An argument I've seen in favor of this choice is that the game wants the party and the player themselves to feel hijacked by Verso's introduction. What better way to demonstrate this by stripping the expeditioners of their agency? But if I'm being honest, giving the player control over Verso is probably the worst choice to make if you want to instill that feeling. Remember how I said Gustave's death was the best example of ludonarrative cohesion in the game? Here's the most excruciating instance of ludonarrative dissonance.
I need to ask you something.
What?
You wouldn't lie to me, right?
I think we're well past that.
On the cliff. Gustave,
What is it?
did you let Renoir kill Gustave? Could you have saved him?
For a character who is meant to be largely static, duplicitous, and an outsider, it's definitely a strange choice to let the player decide on what he should say. Not even Gustave had that. There are interesting directions to take this idea. You could give players the illusion of choice only to demonstrate that Verso and the way he converses with others can't be changed. And for a lot of the supports, you could make the argument that this is the intention, but not for the end of Maelle's support in Act 3. Verso is a character with a defined personality and a predetermined character arc. To give a choice like this supposes one of two things. Number one is that the player should choose what they think Verso would choose in this situation. That's what I did in my first playthrough, and the game rewarded my choice by locking me out of Maelle's final gradient skill. It is a little insane to punish the player for choosing to lie, the thing Verso has been doing without accountability since its introduction. At that point, why make it an option in the first place? Well, maybe the goal is to eliminate Verso and what he wants from the choice entirely and have the player choose for him. But that directly runs in conflict with the concept of Verso hijacking the story. This dissonance, where characters are stripped of their agency following Verso's introduction, while the player's agency is maintained, makes Verso an exceptionally messy character. A character who hinders the growth of half the main cast. A character who is never held accountable when that accountability could be deeply compelling. A character whose most significant moment can be determined by an actor beyond the fourth wall. Maelle is Expedition 33's quote-unquote secret protagonist. She's the only character of the main three, Gustave, Verso, and Maelle, who is present in a major capacity through all three acts. And it is through Maelle that the game more overtly conveys its core themes and messaging. The objective of the main party since the prologue has been to defeat the Paintress, but the Paintress is no more, and the truth is finally revealed. The world of Expedition 33 is a canvas, painted by the Descendre family. And Maelle, the young woman whose journey we have followed since the beginning, is also Alicia, the sister of the true Verso Descendre, who died tragically in the real world. The Paintress and the Curator are Alicia's mother and father respectively. One wishes to preserve the canvas as an escape from her grief, and the other wants to destroy the canvas so that his family can move forward. Maelle and Verso, the party members that have served as the story's main characters, also fall along these two ends of the spectrum. And so, a new conflict emerges. What should happen to the canvas? Is it better to preserve Lumiere to give Maelle a home and support structure in a world of her own creation? Or should Verso let it all die so that Maelle, his sister Alicia, can live a real and fulfilling life with her family? This debate characterizes the entirety of Act 3. Maelle, Verso, Renoir, Alicia, Clea, Aline, they all have their own line in the sand and make their case clear. And Lune and Ciel are there too, I guess. This structure makes Act 3 play out extremely differently from the rest of the game. After the first encounter with Renoir and Lumiere, you can basically go right back at any time, fight the boss, and choose your ending. Whereas Act 1 and 2 were grounded in a plot that kept moving forward, with characters who continued to change and adapt to new circumstances, Act 3 does not have this kind of structural foundation. Instead, it commits hard on providing extensive commentary on its themes. Characters like Maelle and Verso become completely static in this part of the narrative. Their beliefs are set in stone, and no amount of arguing is going to change how they feel about this conflict. In that way, they're less like their own actors in the story and more like avatars or archetypes for their specific perspective and belief system. This is all in service of the split ending, because it was deliberately designed to be a choice left to the player.
So we really want the player to, having gone through all of this and gathered all of this information, for the player with their own personal value system, their own personal perspectives, the path that they have walked in their life, to come to a decision for themselves about what they want to choose, what ending makes sense to them, what ending feels right to them, and it will be different for every person, right? And a lot of it really also comes down to how they choose to interpret certain things about the world, about what's important.
Letting the player choose an ending based on their personal judgment is smart, because it leverages what makes video games unique as a storytelling medium. And the endings themselves are expertly constructed in terms of tone, music, cinematography, and thematic relevance. The problem is the build-up to this choice. The debate is all there is to Act 3. Voicing perspectives back and forth isn't a story, it's commentary. And I don't even know if calling it a debate is accurate. Many of these dialogue scenes feel more like characters presenting their opening statement to each other, and that's it.
You're fighting each other, but you're all doing the same thing.
No.
Eileen wants her son back. Renoir wants you and Eileen back. You want Gustave back. The cycle we needed to break wasn't the gommage. It's your family's cycle of grief.
Verso and Maelle are both driven by emotion and have made their choice for selfish reasons. So it makes sense for these characters to not come to an understanding or agreement. I'm not arguing that this isn't narratively logical, but it is, in my opinion, uninteresting. I know where these two characters land ideologically, and these debates do little to influence me one way or another. Lots of stories end with two protagonists fighting to the death because of differing ideals. It's actually one of my favorite writing tropes, but it's not impactful in Expedition 33 because it feels less like a climax and more like a formality. Maelle and Verso have been verbally exchanging blows since the very first scene of Act 3. The only difference here is the visual depiction of these two fighting for their beliefs and the finality inherent in this narrative device. If the game is going to end with this battle of ideals, the rest of Act 3 is better off using its screen time on storytelling devices that would continue to drive these characters to make difficult and interesting choices. As it is now, the bulk of Act 3's interesting storytelling occurs in the party members' relationship supports with Verso. And these are all great in their own right, but making them optional does sort of imply that they aren't necessary to fully understand the story. That's what I mean when I say these characters are static at this point in the plot. After the Reacher questline, Verso demonstrates true grief and frustration at Maelle in a way that the character hasn't expressed before. And while it's interesting, it doesn't change how the final scenes play out. Whether or not Verso experiences this character moment is inconsequential, and it's a tremendous shame. Act 3 is my least favorite section of Expedition 33, and it took me a long time to figure out why it is that I felt this way. I think it all comes back to this structure, and how it transforms its characters into abstractions of ideas rather than narrative vehicles for these ideas. It may not sound like a massive distinction, but its impact on the ending sequence is palpable. A disappointing end to a tragic ending. To Sandfall Interactive. If, by some miracle, you have come across this video and watched to this point, I want you to know that your work humbles me. I am a young creative person with a lot I want to do, and also a lot of anxieties about my ability to write, to edit, to create things in general.
And I think one of the hardest things about learning as an adult is our own inner critic, because our taste evolves faster than our execution. And it can be so demoralizing when you can envision something beautiful, but what you create is not quite there. And you can see what's wrong with it. You can see how it deviates from your vision, from your taste, but you don't know how to make it right yet.
Making this video has been a 3-month-long journey in its own right, and the vast majority of that time was spent simply turning my thoughts over in my head until I could figure out how to properly communicate them. Is this video actually productive, worthwhile criticism? Is it just a series of nitpicks by a college student who is set to graduate in a month? Does my perspective really even matter when so many people love this work to death? I don't know. I just tried to make the best video I could, and because of that, I can't help but see a little of myself in Sandfall Interactive. Sandfall, I view your work on Expedition 33 as extraordinary because it represents a confidence in one's own art that I wish I could steal. I felt I needed to make this video because the general consensus around your work belies the fact that you are a new team with a long future ahead of you. I want to see you go on to make greater works of art because I know you can. And perhaps it's a bit selfish, but I hope I can too. Thank you for watching my video essay.